appreciate uh, the introduction. Let's see, make sure I have the slideshow done right. Is everyone, am I sharing the screen? Is it?
No, I unshared it. So you need to reshare it.
Is it being shared? Is it being shared now, or do I
No,
need to,
you need to reshare it.
I think I got, there you go. I think that's right. Let's see. Okay, so, all right. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
The screen? Okay. And it's just as well. You'd rather see this than me. So this is the images are much more interesting. Okay. Well, first of all, good afternoon. I think it's just barely good afternoon, but to everyone. I first would like to. Can everyone hear me or see everything? Okay. All right. So first, I'd like to thank all of you for inviting me to speak today on my book that's just recently been published by Harvard University Press. The title is Rotary International: The Selling of American Capitalism. I'm not crazy about the title at all. It was the choice of the publisher, but in the end, they're the publisher, not me. In fact, for many years, the working title was, and it still is in my mind, The Heartland Abroad, Rotary International, and the World of Main Street. And unfortunately for me, a major historian came out with a book in 2019 called The Heartland, in American History. So, so I was just a little too late to the game, and so the book title had to be changed. So the title for today's talk is called The Civic Internationalism of Main Street, 1912 to 1931. So while most everyone in today's meeting is probably has a pretty good idea of what I mean by Main Street, it's not likely you've heard the phrase civic internationalism. So what do I mean by this phrase? That's what's going to require some backstory here on both the history of Rotary International as well as the history of the United States. So in fact, that's one of the key takeaways from today's talk: the rapid growth of Rotary International as a worldwide civic organization on the one hand, and the rise of the United States as a world power by World War I, and then as a global hegemon after World War II on the other hand. These two narratives were all of a piece, an intertwined narrative of global in scale and a century in the making. That's kind of the major point of today's talk, if nothing else. You can see the structure. This is the cover of my book on the left, and then the table of contents on the right. And you can see the 6 chapters, the introduction and the conclusion. So this is a map of the United States and really the Pacific and Atlantic worlds in 1898. So in the aftermath of Spain's defeat in 1898, there was little consensus in the United States on how to administer its newly acquired possessions, Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in particular. But one could add to that list other US possessions as well from different periods and reasons: Alaska, Hawaii, the Midway Islands, American Samoa, and after 1903, the Panama Canal Zone. So the question was a pressing one at the time, and this map kind of conveys that. Was it best for the United States to follow in the footsteps of its so-called Anglo-Saxon cousins, the British Empire? Could or should the nation absorb so many new peoples with so little experience in the, quote, art of self-government, a phrase from the period, circa 1900? Was it possible for the United States to extend its territory so far beyond its continental moorings without losing its Republican heart and soul, or Republican with a small r? Was it wise for the United States to become so entangled, so competitive with European imperial powers? What was the future of this young republic bursting at the seams and on the edge of world power status, again, circa 1900? And yet within only a half century, the United States had taken up the mantle of superpower in defense of, quote, the free world, circa 1950. So this sweeping transformation of the identity of the United States as a pioneering, expanding white republic spanning North America before 1898 to a global hegemon claiming responsibility for overseeing and defending an international system built on global capitalism by the 1950s was, to be sure, a very complex, violent, and contested process. So while for most of the post-World War II era, historical narratives of America's rise to global power have generally privileged the actions and initiatives of the state, for example, the federal government, US foreign policy, the US military, etc. In recent decades, historians have increasingly come to recognize the central role played by non-state actors, such as multinational corporations like Standard Oil, JP Morgan, National City Bank, US Steel, philanthropic foundations like the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, and voluntary associations like the American Red Cross, as well as intellectual communities, missionary societies, professional associations, and transnational networks of many stripes, all of which were helping to extend the reach of the United States interests and influence beyond our borders. So my book explores the reimagining of the international role of the United States during the first half of the 20th century from a parallel perspective. And it is in this context that I tell this story of Rotary's rapid worldwide growth out of the hustle and bustle of Chicago in 1905. So this is a photo of downtown Chicago in the Loop. And if you look carefully in the lower left, you can see Powers Theater, and it talks about the 1900s, 1901 season. So that clearly dates this photograph to 1900, 1901. But you can see the kind of the urban chaos in the streets and the buggies and the street cars. And you don't really see in this image a lot of horse-drawn. If you look closely, you can see a lot of horse-drawn carriages as well. So these were dangerous streets. This was in the city of Chicago was just bursting at the seams with a lot of energy, but in a kind of chaotic sort of way. So it's in this context that the first Rotary Club is coming together. And for those of you who knows anything about the history of Rotary International, you're going to know about the original four founders of the club, and February 23rd, 1905 being the first meeting of the Chicago Rotary Club. You have Sylvester Shiley seated there on the left, Paul Harris, of course, standing with the tie, Gus Lohr is the mining engineer, and Hiram Shorey is the merchant tailor standing off to the right. And then this is a capture of the first Rotary Club, Chicago Rotary Club. This is from October of 1905. So you can see how quickly the club had grown from the 4 original members in February to this October membership list. And you notice here, you see the names of each member in bold letters, but right after them, you can see their classification principle: printer, mining, physician, life insurance, and then their business address. Right. So it already gives you, like with this example here, it gives you an idea of the original rationale of the formation of the club as essentially businessmen and professionals coming together in a kind of social / civic space. But initially, especially in 1905, 1906, 1907, a social space for businessmen to network, right? Again, within the context of this kind of urban chaos. My book thus begins with a simple question. How did the businessmen, professionals, and corporate managers who comprised the social world of America's main streets negotiate, challenge, and contribute to growing international engagement during this crucial period of global ascendancy, again, the first half of the 20th century? That's the real question I'm raising here today and in my book. And we could begin to answer this question, historical question, through the examination of one of the most basic and familiar institutions of Main Street, the local Rotary Club. So this approach starts with the recognition of a simple fact. The local club was not just local. Now that may be already abundantly clear to all of you in 2021, with over 1.2 million Rotarians around the world and 35,000 plus clubs as well. But Rotary clubs were already spreading throughout the United States, Canada, and the UK on the eve of World War I, 1914, and they continued to expand over the course of the 20th century with astonishing speed and effectiveness. This explosion of Rotary clubs, I argue, marked the birth of a new kind of transnational network comprised of both US and non-US businessmen and professionals, a network born out of the progressive era and eventually cast far beyond the shores of the United States, well before World War II. As a result, my book considers a second fundamental question as well. How did businessmen and professionals and corporate managers and so forth outside the United States who became involved with their local Rotary clubs, again, outside the United States, cope with the changing realities of a globalizing economy centered increasingly around the economic, political, and cultural influence of the United States, again, between roughly 1900 and 1950. So these are a series of images of maps taken from the 50th anniversary of Rotary International. They had a publication in 1955, and I still really like these maps. You can see here, kind of in the middle, Seattle, 1909, Tacoma, Portland, Lincoln, Oakland, San Francisco. The first wave of Rotary clubs in the United States between 1905 and 1908 with San Francisco through to 1914, 1915, the first wave of these clubs were in all the major largest cities of the United States and Canada. It's not really until World War I and especially the 1920s that you start getting the Rotary clubs appearing in the smaller second and third and fourth tier cities and towns throughout the United States and many other parts of North America. So that's an important thing to understand about the first wave of growth for Rotary clubs is that they're starting in Chicago, San Francisco, LA, Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, etc., New York City, first and foremost. And then also within very short order, they're also rapidly spreading throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. And if you look at the other maps here around the world, certainly by the 1930s, and that's kind of one of the primary takeaways from today's talk, is that by 1931, 32, 33, 1/3 of all clubs are outside of the United States. So, and this map kind of indicates that of RI's 160,000 plus members in 1935, about 71% were in the US and Canada, almost 12% in Great Britain and Ireland, and the remaining 17% spread throughout all of Latin America, Caribbean, continental Europe, Northern Africa, Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. So there's another way to state those numbers. Nearly 1 in 3 Rotary clubs by 1935 was located outside the United States. Put another way, in the midst of the Great Depression and at the supposed apex of isolationist sentiment in the United States, Rotary was already straddling oceans, continents, and empires, bringing together business and professional men in the name of philanthropic service to their local community and greater international cooperation among themselves, their cities, and their nations. However utopian their aspirations and however contrary to the general tenor of world affairs, especially after 1933, the institutional reach of Rotary International by the 1930s was undeniable. For tens of thousands of members and their families, both in the US as well as abroad, the local Rotary Club was an important and sometimes even vital conduit for social, economic, and professional contact with the world at large. With the majority of members outside of the United States, approximately by the late 60s, early 70s, Rotary managed to translate its civic ideals and business progressivism into a sprawling international NGO, non-governmental organization, with a long history of involvement with the League of Nations, the United Nations, UNESCO, the WHO, and many other basic international institutions. As you know, more recently, RI has partnered with Shelter Box for disaster relief, for example, while expanding its community service and cultural exchange programs in many new and diverse ways that, quite frankly, are hard to keep up with at this point. It's pretty impressive. So these are just close-ups of those larger maps that I mentioned before. So this is an image of the Rotary Club from 1923, clearly in Havana here, Rotary Club de la Habana, right? Along with rapid international growth of Rotary came the need to rationalize and standardize club constitutions, activities, bylaws, and practices, a challenge that resonated in revealing ways with debates at the time on the roles and responsibilities of the United States in the world. With war raging on in Europe after the summer of 1914, the US clubs turned toward Cuba and soon almost all of Latin America, while experiencing significant growth throughout North America as well. The Great War proved to be a boon for both US corporations and for US voluntary associations, the perfect conditions for establishing the first Rotary Club outside of the Anglophone world in Havana. Though quite challenging at first, Rotary's move into Havana in 1916, its first foray into the Spanish-speaking world, proved even more successful than it was thought possible at the time. Through the good offices of well-connected owners of cigar factories in Tampa and Ybor City in Florida, the Havana Club finally took root, which soon led to Rotary clubs in Madrid, Barcelona, and other Spanish cities, as well as throughout all of Cuba and most of Latin America and the Caribbean. Revealingly, many US Rotarians were able to tap into a pre-existing social and business networks established after centuries of Spanish imperial rule, and then convert those networks into more modern forms of social and professional interaction among international businessmen. As a result, Rotary's civic internationalism blossomed in interwar years, largely due to the organization's ability to function as a private non-state actor Even as President Wilson's dreams unraveled after the demise of the League of Nations in the US Senate, and as US foreign policy returned to tariff protectionism under Republican presidents and Congresses in the 1920s, Rotary was thriving inside and outside the United States. This was not a paradox. The international expansion of Rotary clubs was an alternative way for US businessmen to connect with their imagined counterparts in the rest of the world, and for the world to respond in kind. In other words, Rotary's activities and aspirations show how international engagement at the personal, social, and non-state levels during the interwar period were far thicker, far more deeply rooted, and more enduring than previously understood or recognized, and far more than just US foreign policy done on the cheap through informal cultural diplomacy. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to skip to some material from the 6th chapter in my book to provide an example of what I mean by Rotary's civic internationalism in action during the 1920s and 1930s. How did Rotary International manage to bring businessmen outside the US into their world fellowship? So for this, the final portion of today's talk, I'd like to give you a glimpse into that process and a time and place that directly challenged the limits of Rotary's civic internationalism. Who could and could not join in Rotary's, quote, new world of business? Though rarely asked out loud, the question cut to the quick. For Rotarians, the answer turned on who could be transformed through engagement in the new business civilization defined by them and those deemed beyond the pale. Those businessmen outside the Anglophone world of US, Canadian, and British clubs were seeking to join the ranks of Rotary. I've called those non-Anglophone Rotarian recruits the exotic peer. It's not a phrase from the period, it's just a way, a shorthand that I devised to kind of describe potential recruits for modern professional ways of doing business in nations like Cuba, Japan, China, Mexico, Egypt, and so on. But how did Rotary go about identifying and incorporating its imagined counterparts in such far-off places? Were the, quote, main streets of these other nations, cultures, religions, and peoples commensurable with the familiar environs of Rotary's own version of Main Street? So let's shift gears now and consider how RI managed to expand in a time and place that stretched its claims of inclusion and local empowerment to their limits. Southeast Asia in the late 1920s. This image appeared in the Malaya Tribune in 1930 to mark the formation of the Penang and Malacca Rotary Clubs by James Wheeler Davidson. Who was Jim Davidson? Known simply as, quote, the Marco Polo and the Apostle of Rotary, Davidson had a very special task when he, his wife, and his daughter set sail for Europe in 1928. Why? To fill in the gap between Prague and Shanghai with a, quote, golden chain of Rotary clubs, thereby providing the, quote, Rotary traveler with the chance to, quote, take any of the important steamers plying between London and Tokyo and find a Rotary club at nearly every port, end quote. In effect, by the late 1920s, the upper echelons of Rotary, by then comprised of many members from Canada, Western Europe, East Asia, and Latin America, had come to view the gap between the Eastern European clubs and the Chinese and Japanese clubs on the opposite end of Eurasia as an intolerable disconnect. So in the aftermath of World War I, Rotary was mapping out its future international expansion along pre-established trade routes and across imperial, political, and geographical frontiers, again with an astonishing degree of confidence and sense of inevitability. Why would RI's headquarters put so much faith in Jim Davidson to complete such a grand project? Well, there are many reasons, and I'm going to give you a brief biography of Jim Davidson. Born in Austin, Minnesota in 1872, Jim first made his mark organizing tours for members of Austin's Opera House to New York City and then around the country. During one of those tours, he managed to impress Robert Peary so much that he was included on Peary's second expedition to the North Pole in 1893 as its youngest member. Davidson nearly froze to death in the attempt, and it left him with a permanent limp. Undaunted, Jim then changed course by becoming a war correspondent covering the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95 for several major US newspapers. Due to some intelligence Jim provided Japanese officers while he was in Formosa, now Taiwan, the city of Taipei was occupied by Japanese troops without a fight. As a result, Jim was decorated with the 5th class of Order of the Rising Sun by the Japanese Emperor in 1895, one of only a few to receive such a high honor from the Japanese Empire at that time. Because of the notoriety that came with his syndicated articles in the media, the US government appointed Jim US consular agent in Formosa, where he then wrote the first history of the island in English. Entitled Formosa Past and Present, the book was so thorough and successful that he was formally recognized as a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in 1903. That same year, he was transferred to Manchuria, where he chronicled for US newspapers the final phases of the completion of Russia's Trans-Siberian Railroad. By 1904, Jim was named commercial attaché and acting consulate general in Shanghai, one of the largest and most significant diplomatic delegations of the time. Because of typhoid, Jim decided to return to the US in 1905. And after meeting Lillian Dow during his trip across the Pacific, he married and chose to settle down in Winnipeg, Canada, and start a business with his brother. But the couple soon moved to Calgary, where he became a successful entrepreneur through investments in the Calgary Colonization Company. With the coming of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, Jim's investments paid off well as land and lumber were sold to US farmers looking to settle north of the 49th parallel. So by 1912, Jim Davidson was managing several successful businesses while actively planning out the future of the city of Calgary. In 1914, he joined the newly formed Calgary Rotary Club as a natural complement to his civic and business endeavors. But it was the coming of the post-war challenges for permanent peace after 1919 that sparked Jim's dedication to working the upper echelons of Rotary. Quite familiar with the world of publishing, Jim's first task was to head up Rotary's publications committee. In fact, his first article in the Rotarian in 1920 was entitled Rotary as an International Power. Subtle title. A year later, in 1921, Davidson joined up with another Canadian Rotarian, James Ralston, who later became Canada's Minister of Defense during World War II, and the two of them sailed to Australia and New Zealand to establish new clubs in that part of the British Empire. After several months, Davidson and Ralston managed to start up Rotary clubs in Melbourne, Sydney, Auckland, and Wellington. After several more years serving on RI's Committee for Foreign Extension, and then later renamed the International Service Committee, Jim was the ideal choice in 1928 for answering the call as Rotary's Marco Polo. Indeed, he embodied RI's civic internationalism like no other. So I hope you can all see why Chapter 6 focuses on the story of Jim and Lillian Davidson in their travels between 1928 and 31 through Asia. Over the course of the next 3 years, the Davidsons found themselves operating in a variety of strikingly different business and political cultural environments, ranging from Athens, Istanbul, and Cairo, all in political flux, to the deserts and oil fields of Iran and Iraq. So this is from Alexandria Rotary Club. This is taken from the Rotarian. This is a map, a kind of stylized map of their travels from the Eastern Mediterranean and Beirut across by land to Baghdad. So they traveled from the well-established trading centers of the British Empire, such as Calcutta, Bombay, and Singapore, and Hong Kong, to key cities in Dutch and French colonies such as Jakarta, Batavia, and Saigon. This is the Lahore India Rotary Club in 1930, I believe, with an itinerary that also included Manila, Taipei, Shanghai, Bangkok, Mukden, Harbin, Seoul, and many Japanese cities. The Davidsons were also hopscotching through independent nations such as China and Siam, as well as Japanese and Russian colonial possessions. This map represents the Davidsons' travels and appears in Chapter 6 of my book. And you can see in the upper far left, Romania, Sofia, you can see the Black Sea. And so Istanbul is the first city where Jim Davidson tries to set up a club. He almost succeeds, but it doesn't quite take root until the 1950s. But Athens, Alexandria, Cairo, Jerusalem, you can see their travels down through the Persian Gulf into South Central Asia and India, which is the center of the British Empire for the period. You can see all their travels through Southeast Asia, all the way down into the Dutch East Indies and back up along the coasts into China and Manchuria, and ending in Japan by March of 1931. So in many ways, the Davidsons trailing through Asia, the label used in Rotary's monthly magazine to describe the regular chronicles of their travels from 1928 to 31, marked the high point of Rotary's civic internationalism during the interwar period. So on the eve of the Great Depression, the establishment of 23 new Rotary clubs between Prague and Shanghai by Jim, as well as the serialization of their travels in the Rotarian by his wife, Lillian, linked the domestic space of Rotarians' hearth and home in North America with descriptions of their travels abroad. So much like the National Geographic and travel literature in general, the Davidsons' journeys to the cities of Asia were also meant to represent those far-off cities as places with different yet friendly faces, where one might even consider touring with a family or especially searching out new business prospects in the near future. In essence, the Davidsons' adventures provided a kind of stagecraft for American business culture and domestic sensibilities and lands once seen as well beyond the scope of US interests and influence. So Jim's successful negotiations through the business cultures of European and non-European elites in order to establish these new clubs advanced concrete US interests in the region. In addition, Lillian's writings became as important to her readers, both men and women, as she, a wife and mother, presence of Rotary clubs and her own travels, family's travels in such distant lands seemed natural and attainable. So in their own way, both Lillian and Jim were engaging in a form of domestication. Jim with his 2,200 plus sit-down interviews with potential Rotarian recruits drawn from Asia's business and professional elites, and Lillian with her family-friendly travelogues discussed widely at Rotary clubs everywhere. I just want to do a quick check on time. How much time do I have for Q&A?
You've got 10 minutes.
Okay, let's do this. All right. So let's focus on a particular site of Jim's operations, in this case, Kuala Lumpur and the Federated Malay States in 1929. The Davidsons' visit to Kuala Lumpur triggered a series of debates on the possibility of racial classification within Rotary. Given Rotary's long-standing emphasis on professional credentials and marketplace identities, like the business titles in the October 1905 membership rules that I showed before, this became a significant challenge. How would Rotary's civic internationalism hold up in such uncharted waters? How far could Rotary's internationalist vision expand its circle of economic citizenship and fraternal equality among the exotic peers of Southeast Asia? So the Kuala Lumpur Rotary Club was not officially part of Rotary, at least not officially so. It had not been credentialed as such. And that was the problem. Founded in 1928 by L.D. Gammons, an Englishman in the Federated Malay States Service, the club had been operating without an official charter. So the club members anxiously awaited the arrival of the Davidsons from Burma in order to demonstrate their legitimacy as a club and as a result, be granted an official charter. Gammons first came into contact with Rotary in 1918 when his wife's cousin invited him, a captain in the British Army at the time, to the Detroit Rotary Club. And this is a really common story during this period of people traveling around the world and coming in contact with a Rotary Club somewhere in North America and then kind of taking that idea abroad. So Jim explained in his report to Rotary back offices headquarters back in Chicago, Gammons, quote, Gammons found in Malaya a most happy situation, in fact, a unique one. He found Chinese, Malays, Indians, and Europeans living in harmony to a degree that exists nowhere else that I know of, end quote. So for fear that the harmony might not last, Gammons decided to work through his position in the British colonial government, which brought him in more intimate contact with the different racial groups than would perhaps any other government office. Quote. So in order to establish a club with a membership comprising different racial groups, end quote. Since his own father had also been a Rotarian in England, Gammons chose to write Rotary's European Secretariat in Zurich, Switzerland, for pamphlets and publications, and then contacted Rotarians in Calcutta and Shanghai for more advice, they being the closest Rotary clubs thousands and thousands of miles away. Rather than start his own club, the British colonial administrator used Rotary as a template. So when the Kuala Lumpur Club filled out the necessary paperwork for securing a charter in 1928, however, Gammons made an argument for the, quote, widening of the classification rule in order to accommodate the membership of a Chinese, an Indian, and a European barrister or lawyer. Gammons understood that RI's rules on classification permitted only one kind of barrister at a time in any given club in order to avoid competition among and domination by any particular business or profession in each club. A situation that went back to the origins of the Chicago Club in 1905. So this classification principle, in short, was the linchpin to Rotary's claim that every Rotary club in the world was a, quote, representative cross-section of its business community. It was also the most significant litmus test for membership credentials for potential recruits. But Gammons also understood Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, arguing that, quote, representatives of the same profession here, but of different nationalities, normally have less social intercourse with each other than if they were of different professions but the same nationality, end quote. In short order, Jim grasped what Gammons was trying to do in stretching the rules on classification. In Kuala Lumpur, one could not presume one integrated business community comprised of distinct and complementary lines of business and professions. And since community in Kuala Lumpur was undeniably complicated and by many distinct racial, religious, and cultural and linguistic groups. RI's civic internationalism, as defined according to the terms of US business culture, could not possibly function in Kuala Lumpur, nor in any other Malaysian city, without a genuine grappling with racial differences and identities. With an itinerary that included all other cities in the Malaysian peninsula, Jim knew quite well the problem was hardly unique to Kuala Lumpur. At stake were membership qualifications for non-US businessmen worldwide, and possible repercussions, quote, back home, if Jim were seen as undermining the legitimacy of Rotary's civic internationalism with suspect or unworthy recruits or kind of invented classifications for businesses and professions. So moreover, the unquestioned solidarity of the whiteness forged across the Atlantic early on for Rotary in the first decades, and only rarely challenged by, say, visiting Japanese and Latin American Rotarians, had finally come under real scrutiny within the ranks of Rotary. Put another way, Rotary's extension into Southeast Asia in 1929 had finally placed front and center the issue of race, as it prevented the possibility of ignoring or erasing non-white businessmen and professionals. It was one thing to pocket veto proposed Rotary clubs in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and Kingston, Jamaica, for example, which happened in the early 1920s. To quietly avoid recruitment of Afro-Cubans in Havana and non-white Puerto Ricans in San Juan, which happened, to hope visiting Latin American Rotarians were not too dark-skinned for hotel managers in the Jim Crow South, which was also an ongoing issue, and to allow a handful of Asians of extraordinarily high class status into clubs, quote, over time, which also happened. But it was something quite another to reject the already formed Kuala Lumpur club outright because of its racial and cultural pluralism. That just wasn't really possible. So especially when it was already a known presence in the city and a formal approval of its charter was already seen as a fait accompli in the city's press. So Rotary simply had to adapt to the new conditions, or to choose to avoid that part of the world, or risk exposing the fundamental contradictions of race and equality at the core of its entire internationalist projects. So Jim had to think and act fast. How far can the canvas of Rotary's Main Street be stretched? In the end, Davidson, Gammons, and the Kuala Lumpur Rotarians were arguing for a broader conception of membership in RI and Rotary than one's own economic status within the familiar confines of Main Street. One of RI's most basic propositions, that transnational market identities were colorblind, was yet again being tested, really tested. And Jim understood the import of the moment. I think for the sake of time, I have to go straight to the conclusion. It's just the last minute here, and then we can jump to the Q&A. After another year of traveling in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, and East Asia, Jim and his family returned to a hero's welcome in Vancouver in 1931. Within the month, Jim arrived at the Chicago headquarters of Rotary in order to present his formal report on all his travels. The 23 new Rotary clubs formed between Prague and Shanghai not only fulfilled Rotary's quest to, quote, girdle the globe with Rotary clubs, but it also proved significant epicenters of growth after World War II. Though Jim's innovations did not bear much fruit beyond Southeast Asia before World War II, they certainly did during the Cold War, especially in the midst of the period of decolonization in the 1960s and 70s going forward. Thanks to Davidson, there was no part of the world considered beyond the reach of Rotary after 1931. Much like the Wilsonian post-war vision of international cooperation, the world seemed not so different from the American heartland after all, so long as the fundamental contradictions on race and class, so embedded within US business practices, social relations, and politics, went unchallenged at home. And so long as the exotic peers of Rotary's, quote, world fellowship tempered their demands for genuine economic and political independence abroad. I could go on, but I'll just, and this is Jim and Lillian Davidson, and you can see just down below in the Raffles Hotel in Singapore. So this would have been 1930. So you can see Jim writing there, and then Lillian with her portable typewriter.
And those sexy, sexy socks.
Yeah. Let me see it in here. This is the last thing. if you look carefully, you can see Jim Davidson standing up in the middle. This is at the Tokyo Rotary Club, and you can see the Tokyo Club was founded in 1920. This is the centerpiece of chapter 4 from my book. But it was very high, the highest levels of Japanese society, and especially the business world. Tokyo was premised on that, and so this was like the bankers. This wasn't just some generic hotel in Tokyo. This was the Bankers Club, essentially. So for Jim Davidson, remember his biographical history, he had this special status with the Japanese Empire going back to 1895, right? So the Tokyo Club especially was his last farewell dinner, and you can see that the high level of this meeting and of the the environment. So I'll end it with that. Okay. So questions.
Question.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Hey,
Hold on.
thank
Yeah, I'm
you.
listening.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I had to miss quite a bit of it because we had an unexpected visitor. However, I do appreciate your taking the time to talk to us, Brendan. And it's interesting to see, I kind of, in the little bit that I caught, there was obviously some consideration of class as it relates to the status of our Rotarian friends in Asia. What's interesting is it seems like that kind of continues today. It seems like that's something that's been baked in, but I've never heard that discussion. Obviously we've heard of how Rotary excluded women and people of color. Even the Birmingham Club, I think, had issues with people of color as recently as 2000. So it's interesting to see this discussion of class. I don't really have a question in there, just a comment, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book now, because I'm under the impression that there'll be a lot more to delve into as it relates to class in Rotary.
Yeah, thanks. In some ways, chapter 1 really goes into Wilsonianism, class, and gender. And then chapter 2 goes into kind of the 1920s and 1930s, and it really looks at race and class and around the world, because again, this is a concrete example. You can, it's easy to kind of have these grand internationalist aspirations. It's something very different to work out on the ground in concrete, specific locations and contexts, and say, well, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by the classification principle in Kuala Lumpur in 1929? This is challenging stuff. Or for that matter, what do we mean when we say, these very well-respected and well-to-do Mexican Rotarians go across the border into Texas for Rotary conferences and conventions, and they're walking into a Jim Crow environment, and suddenly they're hit with Jim Crow laws in 1935, 1922, 1955 for that matter, 1965, etc. And these become real litmus tests of what of these promises of civic internationalism. And sometimes Rotary kind of rises to the occasion. I think the example here with Kuala Lumpur, in a very significant way rises to the occasion. But at the same time, I can give you lots of examples where they don't so much rise to the occasion, but it's always a contested process. It's never a given. It's not like you have, this is the official version and everyone agrees with it. It's never like that. When you look at the actual archives and debates, it's a real struggle then and now. How can it not be? But again, this is all running parallel to the emergence of the United States as a global hegemonic power over the course of the 20th century. It's simply, in many ways, a microcosm of the expansion of the United States as a US power. So no shocker there that it's reflecting the bigger picture, right?
And at the same time, you've got the United States about to adopt some pretty strict immigration policies in
1920s,
1922,
for example. That's right.
23. Yeah.
That's exactly
I'm sorry,
right.
Myrna.
No, this is fine. This is great stuff. This is
I had a real life situation happen. A young man interactor in Israel put together a project I thought was phenomenal. And I wanted to introduce him to my Rotaractors in Lebanon. And my Lebanese contact said they won't be able to do that because they cannot enter into any kind of a contract with anyone in Israel. Well, then after working with my Lebanon group, I realized that their district goes around, it's a very interesting district according to which countries that they can work with. So it's still happening today. And also, we want to get Rotary back in Cuba, but the United States cannot go to promote that. It has to be the Caribbean and the Latin American countries that go to Cuba to help promote getting Rotary back into Cuba. I'm sorry I'm late. I was really looking forward to introducing you.
Okay.
Thank you for coming today.
And by the way, chapter 5 of the book is focusing on Havana and Cuba in particular, as it's in the Latin American story more generally, but it's specifically, that's it. But it's more specifically, it's about Havana and Cuba in particular, again, as a kind of microcosm of exactly what Myrna was just describing. So, but that story, that narrative ends in the 1950s. So, the whole world of Castro is beyond the scope of this book narratively.
We have a question here in the room. Where can you buy your book?
I don't know.
It's your pick. Sell it.
It's on. If you just put my name in Amazon, you get the link to buy it. Just put Brendan Goff into Amazon, and it comes up. I also have. I was going to say real quick. I have a 2 weeks ago. I did an hour-long interview, a podcast that's now an accessible link. I think I sent it to you, Myrna. I don't know if I have, but and it was an interview by a grad student at Vanderbilt who's in this field, and he had read the book, and so his questions are very well crafted. And usually I hate the sound, like everyone, I hate the sound of my voice being recorded, right? But I actually listened to the whole hour long. I was like, those were really good questions, right? So I can send a link. I just got it, I guess, a week ago, but I can send the link to that podcast as well, which would help flesh out at the more academic level, but still, some of these questions that we're raising here.
Can you send those to me, Brandon?
Yeah, I'll do that.
And also, I did record this. Is it okay to put it on YouTube?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, my